The rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. Listen, O Lord of the meeting rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay. The poem you just heard is the medieval Indian equivalent of a protest. Because medieval Indians didn't have constitutions or courts to guarantee their rights, they sang to their gods. And when there were many people singing, potters, weavers, cowherds, cleaners, watchmen, they sometimes sparked off a revolution. Today in Thinking Medieval, here's the story of the Lingayats or Virashaivas. Today, one of Karnataka's most powerful voting blocs, they began as a 12th century movement that battled caste proscriptions, promoted women's agency, and worshipped the god Shiva with meat, onion curries, and other dietary no-nos. They even toppled one of India's mightiest empires. In the late 12th century, a time of massive political and social churn as we've seen in these earlier videos, the grandest polity of the Deccan was crumbling. This was the empire of the Chalukyas of Kalyana, present-day Basava Kalyan, a glittering city in northern Karnataka. For nearly 200 years, the Chalukyas had dominated the Deccan plateau, raiding present-day Madhya Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh and fighting apocalyptic wars with the Chola Empire. Chalukya military success created a wealthy aristocracy, many of whom built temples like this one. But there was also a massive exploited working class. According to Lingayat legend, people across the social spectrum began to compose brief, highly emotive poems to Shiva called vachanas, like the one we heard at the beginning of this video. Earthy, humble, and lacking the literary pretensions of the court, they spread rapidly. The Chalukya emperors, meanwhile, were toppled in a coup by the Kalachuri aristocratic family who were closely linked to the orthodox Brahmins of the city of Kalyana. Now, a young gifted Brahmin called Basava was one of the Kalachuri king's ministers. Influenced by popular vachanas, he set up a great structure in Kalyana, the Hall of Experience or Anubhava Mandapa. This drew to it the brightest vachana poets of the day, such as Mahadevi Akka, a female renunciant who had abandoned her husband and wandered the world naked, clothed only in her hair. Here they eagerly sang to Shiva, debated theology, and forged a radical new social alliance, calling themselves Shiva's heroes or Virashaivas. Shiva's heroes, according to later tradition, denounced the temples of the rich, denied the practice of untouchability, and sometimes even denied the authority of the Vedas. But disaster came when Shiva's heroes conducted a marriage between a Dalit man and a Brahmin woman. The Kalachuri king, prompted by the city's Brahmins, expelled the community and scattered them across the Deccan. But the heroes had grown too popular already. They assassinated the king, prompting social strife, riots, and a crisis in Kalyana. To this day, the phrase Ketittu Kalyana, Kalyana is wrecked, is still used occasionally to express disaster in Kannada. Now, this is the legend that Lingayats tell of themselves today after many centuries of storytelling. But a text written by a Lingayat poet just 60 years after their foundational crisis tells a somewhat different story. It has some shocking views on women's agency, social identity, and religious rivalry. In his 2018 book, Shiva's Saints, The Origins of Devotion in Kannada according to Harihara's Ragalegalu, Professor Gil Ben-Herut analyzed the Ragalegalu, probably the earliest written text of the Lingayat community. The poet Harihara surprisingly makes no mention of the Hall of Experience and actually claims that Basava, one of the community's most important saints, conducted communal worship of Shiva in a temple in his private palace. That's right, the same Basava who sang to Shiva that while the rich built temples, the poor could do nothing. But Harihara's most surprising characters are women, possibly based on actual historical figures. Vaijakave, a devout Shaivite, is forced by her family to marry a Jain. One day she gives food meant for Jain mendicants to Shaivites instead. Her husband is furious and beats her. Vaijakave then opens the local Jain temple, revealing that a Shiva Linga had magically appeared there overnight. In a move completely against Brahmin orthodoxy, she, a woman, personally converts the community into Shaivism. Then there's the story of Mahadevi Akka, the nude, wandering mendicant whose devotion to Shiva drives her to leave her husband. That was absolutely unthinkable for most medieval women. Harihara's depiction of another female devotee, Nimbavve, is even more shocking. While still young, Nimbavve loses her entire family and is forced to become a domestic worker. After being propositioned by a Shaivite mendicant, she decides to serve the community through intimate union with male devotees. What could this mean? As Ben Herod notes, perhaps it was believed that all deeds serving this new, fervently devotional Shaivite community, donations of food, of wealth, even sex, were meant to be celebrated. Once you were part of this group, you could bend all the rules in the service of Shiva, whether gender roles or even caste norms. And there's plenty of examples. In Book 10 of the Basaveshwara Deva Ragale, Harihara depicts the saint Basava eating with Dalit Shaivites. Dalit Shaivites also educate themselves in the Vedas and defeat Buddhists in debate, which is an almost exact inversion of Dalit politics today. Meanwhile, non-Shaivites are attacked. Basava himself calls royal Vaishnavite Brahmins untouchable, quote unquote, and Jains are assaulted or even outright massacred. Later Lingayat texts, such as the 13th century Basava Purana, sing of many saints who attacked and destroyed Jain temples. Maybe the early Lingayat or Virashaiva community has lessons for us today. This medieval movement was a social coalition. It brought new groups into the fold, giving them all a new identity as devotees of Shiva. To build this coalition, they were more than willing to break away from some norms. Women were allowed more autonomy if they were Shaivites. Non-Brahmin groups had their traditions respected and brought into mainstream worship if they were Shaivites. But to tighten their own group identity, Harihara and other early Lingayat poets created an other, which is to say anyone who was not Shaivite. Progress and emancipation was for us, not for them. Dalit and Brahmin Shaivites eat together in the Ragalegalu, but Vaishnavites and Jains were kept away and vilified. Ultimately, the medieval Lingayat community wasn't able to leverage its ideas into real political power. Instead, they evolved into a relatively amorphous social group. In subsequent centuries, Vaishnavism became the Deccan's premier imperial religion, building a massive base of popular support, pilgrimage sites, and monastic networks. In historical terms, it's only recently, thanks to intensive political lobbying and consolidation around priestly lineages, that Lingayats have become a major force in Karnataka's elections. Now, we can't judge the people of the past, but we can see in front of our eyes that modern community building follows similar patterns. In India's majoritarian politics today, insiders are offered equality and dignity, while outsiders are reviled and vilified. As long as progress and emancipation are limited by a line between us and them, history will only continue to repeat itself. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.